Yo, 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 welcome back to Sitting with DJ Lobeezy. I'll be spitting some facts that don't be greasy. That 5 you be sporting on the AP will be easy. It'll be like learning the language of the Japanesey. Yeah, and if you want to please me, fetch me a Coke Zero with a hamburger and cheesy. Alright, enough of that. Sorry, guys. There's a small contingency of students that want to hear me continue rapping. So, sorry to the rest of you who that sounds like nails on a chalkboard. All right, kids. Today we're going to talk about humanism. Got lots to cover because you got to get this study guide wrapped up. So I'm going to post this here shortly. All right. So, when discussing one of the themes of the Renaissance, humanism is one of them. We've kind of already talked about it at some point, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on a few things. All right, so it is a contrast from the Middle Ages when humans did not necessarily value, or that society did not value individual humans, but this is a difference. This is where humans are valued for their achievement, and we start to see that to be an emphasis. Okay, when we look back to the classics, because the classics is, of course, an inspiration throughout this whole period. The focus on humanism was a way of kind of creating excellence in an individual in three areas. And it was this blending of, not necessarily blending, but achievement of excellence in the intellectual, the physical, and then also in virtuous living that became the ideal. That was something that was something that was valued. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few things. And when we look at Rome, Roman government was seen as an ideal. It was kind of an evolution that came out of the democracy that we see appear in Athens during the Greek civilization. The type of government that the Romans had was one in which a republican form of government where there was representation of the majority or representation of the populace, and governing was left to those elected officials. It seemed to be a bit more pragmatic as an approach to governing, as opposed to everyone having a say in the day-to-day decisions that the government makes. Okay, most people have to work for a living, so that wasn't seen as something that was very pragmatic. All right. When we look at the Romans, there's a couple of figures that I put in there in the notes that are important, and Cicero is one of them. Cicero is somebody who saw the value of a republican form of government, and when it was under assault, nearing the time of about circa 50 BC, we see Julius Caesar emerge as a strong general, and we start to see the transition from a republican form of government to that of an empire. Anyway, one of the things that Cicero is one of the reasons why Cicero is valued was because of his remarkable speaking ability, and that is going to be something that is going to be valued. Somebody who is a powerful speaker or orator is seen as intellectual, is seen as skilled, not only being able to speak well, but also to write eloquently, was something that was prized, and Cicero had both of those skills. And so his writing will become important. The rediscovery of his work is important. When we talk about ideal forms of government, this period here during the Renaissance kind of foreshadows the Enlightenment, when we will learn about the writings of John Locke and his treatise where he deals with natural rights and how man has these natural rights, and that government's function is to protect those natural rights. We'll also learn about the writings of Voltaire, who talks about freedom of speech as well. The point that this is a rediscovery, when we're talking about the Renaissance, a rediscovery of the classics, make sure that you understand that the Middle Ages was a time that they did value the classics, but most people were illiterate, and because of the chaos of the age, it wasn't a consistent valuing of the classics. But when we look at the Carolingian Renaissance under the Frankish king Charlemagne, around the year 800 AD, there was a Carolingian Renaissance which focused on classical learning, and then also under the scholastic movement of the early 13th century, with the attempt to harmonize Christianity or Christian teaching, Catholic dogma, with that of the classics, specifically the teachings or the philosophy, the moral philosophy of Aristotle. Okay, and so we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that is what the scholastic movement means. It's blending of faith and reason to arrive at truth, and that was something that Thomas Aquinas was known for. All right, moving on, humanism talks about the importance of morality, as I mentioned earlier, and when we look at the scholar Marsilio Ficino, who is known for creating a Platonic academy in Florence, the term Platonic is actually Neoplatonic for the Greek philosopher Plato. So if we go all the way back to the Greek classics, there were three Greek philosophers known, the first of which was Socrates, and Plato was the student of Socrates. Socrates met his fate because he was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens, and the nature of his crime was because he was, in his teachings with his students, he was deviating away from the mythological stories, as far as to better understand the nature of what was going on around them, the natural phenomena that they saw occurring, and he was attempting to use logic and reason as a way to perhaps replace those mythological stories with something that was a little bit more natural. And so, because he was somebody that talked about the importance of respecting the law, he was ordered to drink poison, hemlock, and he did so willingly. And his student, then Plato, was extremely critical of democracy, because he thought that it was insane that his great teacher, that he was ordered to drink poison, and that to him was evidence that people could not be trusted to govern themselves, that was too awesome of a responsibility, and they were ill-equipped And we're going to talk about that throughout this year, this idea of mob rule, and that is something that scares people, that the masses are uneducated and are incapable of, again, that responsibility. And so he was very much against that. There's something else with Plato's philosophy that's important to understand, and that's his, and you see it evidenced in the allegory of the cave, which is an old story that he uses to talk about how we have additional senses that help us interpret the world around us, not just our five senses. And the allegory of the cave is used to kind of explain some of that. But there's something more with Plato that these Neo-Platonists and this Platonic Academy attempts to delve into, is the very close similarity that Plato's philosophy is with Christianity, because he talks about how we have this ability to perceive things outside of our five senses, and that there is an alternate sense of reality, if you will, and existence. And this existentialism is linked to a soul that he talks about. And so you have Plato very early on talking about the existence of a soul, and that is very consistent with Christianity. And then he also talks about this supreme being, which Christians obviously take as God. And so for a lot of the devout Christians, kind of getting into the classics was safe, was something that they could kind of see the crossover and the overlap between the two. And so that was something that Marsilio Ficino was involved in, as well as Pico della Mirandola. All right. So the importance of a virtuous life was something that had lots of application in this time period. And when we talk about a virtuous life, we talk about the importance of the perfectibility of mankind, that that the Renaissance is as much a reform movement as anything else, and that it's important to educate man, to make sure that man can be more involved in governing, because it's going to take somebody who's well educated to be able to understand the complexities of government, and so therefore they need to be duly educated. And that when we talk about civic humanism, man has a duty, man has an obligation or a responsibility to help govern. And so that can be easily translatable today, because we have a republic in which 18-year-olds are allowed to vote, and it's your civic responsibility that you should do so, but you should do so in an informed way. And since this movement was urban, it took all people kind of pitching in to not just vote, but to make society better in any way that they could. And certainly education is a great way of doing that. So at any rate, we see that these humanist writers will serve as, they're going to be the tutors, private tutors for a lot of these wealthy elite and their children, but they're going to also be very instrumental in establishing a new type of curriculum known as a humanistic curriculum. Latin, Greek, the classics, math, music, philosophy. So the idea is to create a well-rounded individual. And, if you go to college campuses today or look online at their fields of study, often many of them have a school known as the humanities. And so the humanities is this broad-based education, and it gets its start here in the Renaissance period. Okay? Moving on to some of the humanistic writers, we have Francesco Petrarch, who is seen as the father of humanism. He is a writer who's responsible for the revival of the classics. He worked for the Pope, and it was during this time that he gained access to a lot of the monastic libraries that existed in France. This is during the Babylonian captivity, so the papacy was located in Avignon, France, and so his privilege of going to a lot of visiting monastic libraries was something that interested him, and he pored over many what were believed to be lost works because the monks had lived a cloister life for centuries, and very few outside of it knew the existence of these books. And as he studied the classics, he became more and more, unhappy with his own time period that he was living in. And he was actually one of the first to kind of coin the phrase Dark Ages to kind of refer to this block of time ever since Rome had collapsed or circa 500. And historians since have used that, although it's not an apt term, Dark Ages, because we know that there was a lot of learning that was taking place and a lot of study of the classics during the Middle Ages, but still it is a term worth at least exploring. Perhaps the first 500 years of the Middle Ages could be described as the Dark Ages, but certainly not the latter half. At any rate, he is known for his use of deviating away from classical Latin in his writings and using Italian. He is responsible for helping develop the modern Italian language, and others followed in his footsteps. Let's see. He was known for writing poetry, using prose, which is the way in which people talk. He wrote sonnets, and many of his sonnets were, over 300 of them, were about love. And the topic for many of his sonnets was this beautiful woman featured here named Laura, who was actually married, and so there's some evidence to suggest that she didn't even know who he was, but he pined for her and is responsible for writing a number of these types of poems. Let's see, when we look at some of the, go back, this picture of patriarch here with these this headdress of leaves. These are called laurel leaves, and laurel leaves was a sign of a poet. It was also could be used to be a prophet, whether he was or not. I don't think that's the case, but it is also the term, or the laurel leaf symbolizes achievement, and it is sometimes used as it has historically been used as a symbol of victory. Okay, so the laurel leaf, and that's what he's wearing. But I think that has more to do with his chosen career as a poet. Let's see. Anything else I want to? Nope. Time to move on. Giovanni Boccaccio. He is the author. We've talked about him before. He was the author of the Decameron, and he was who gave us firsthand evidence about the nature of the bubonic plague. And the story follows 10 young people as they flee the bubonic plague when it reaches Florence, and they hide out in a villa in the countryside, and they spend 10 days, and they while away that time telling tales. So each person is responsible for telling 10 stories to help pass the time, and there we get 100. So 100 stories, and these stories vary in subject matter. There are those who say that this is a satire, so that is a revival of a classical form of literature, usually referred to as a comedy. Many times the comedies were satire, and it pokes fun at the follies of people. One of the characteristic pieces of the Decameron is that it pokes fun at those traits that were specifically feudal or definitely medieval. And so, in a sense, he is poking fun at his own time. And, this is a nice kind of demarcation from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. And so that they're, making fun of like old values, so it's time to move on. It's time to turn the page. And so that's kind of the significance of Boccaccio's work. When we look at some of the earlier styles, I just want to, there's a few types of literature that I want to make sure that we're familiar with that come from, times before. When we look at medieval literature, usually most of the writing was religious in matter, typically theological. So there are a number of people who have contributed to that. There was the epic kind of poem that was more of an adventure tale that was definitely seen as medieval. There were those who talked about a lot of the values of the knight or the warrior, and so chivalry was a topic that was up for discussion. So when we look back historically just at some literature, medieval literature, the earliest piece that we see is that of Beowulf. Beowulf was supposed to have been written or came up with, it was a oral story for about 3 centuries. They believe it was written down in about, what do I have that in my notes, about the circa 1000. And this story follows, Beowulf, who slays this monster named Grendel and his mother. And so we learn a lot about the virtues or the values of a warrior. There's another tale or another epic, and it's called the Song of Roland, and that was about circa 1100, and this is known as the first or the oldest French epic poem, and it tells the story of Charlemagne and his defeat of the Muslims inside of Spain over the Pyrenees Mountains, and it's the death of one of the great warriors, Roland. And since we're all Spartans, in my mind, this story bears strong resemblance to the story 300, and where the Spartans are defeated by the Persians. Thermopylae, the Battle of Thermopylae. I think there's some similarities between these two, but it's an interesting story nonetheless. And let's see, who else? Getting back to the religious or theological pieces, the allegory was very important, and you can see a picture of the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri, and so that was an important medieval form of literature. And then we also see the important work of Thomas Aquinas, who was a Dominican monk, and he wrote a piece called Summa Theologica, which is widely regarded as one of the most important pieces in Western philosophy. And it is an attempt by Aquinas to more or less combine or reconcile, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, Christian dogma with the philosophy of Aristotle. So he was obviously a scholastic, and scholasticism was just more or less a philosophy that we see in the late 13th century. Anyway, one of the important pieces in this Summa Theologica was Thomas Aquinas's proof of the existence of God, and there are 5 ways in which he did that, and so that's a very interesting piece. All right, so moving on to Machiavelli, I want to talk about his importance. He was a humanistic writer who lived in Florence during this very chaotic age where there was fighting among many of the city-states and also the occupation of foreign powers, particularly, specifically the French. And he was ousted from his position, and so he attempted to kind of share his ideas about what he was witnessing. And he was somebody that was extremely critical of the nature of man and thought that humans, in order for them, he was well versed on the classics, and in his mind, he was kind of like Plato in that he was critical of man, and that in order for people to govern themselves, they have to be virtuous. And he didn't think that mankind was. He felt like man was very self-serving, and that in order for a leader to be effective, he was going to have to kind of take that into consideration. If we go back and look at the rule that existed for leaders, kind of the style in which they were expected to govern, because of Christianity, they were expected to govern as Christian kings. But it's even a little bit more than that. If you go to the writings of St. Augustine of Hippo, who was a religious figure in right around the year 300 A.D., he experienced, or he lived through, St. Augustine lived through the sacking of Rome early on by Germanic tribes, and there were many people who criticized the Roman Empire for its switch from being a polytheistic type religion to that of Christianity, and that that they were being cursed and blamed for that reason. He writes or responds, Augustine of Hippo, with a book called The City of God, and The City of God is his take on things, and says that man has lived selfishly for far too long and lived for himself in a secular manner, and this is why Rome is beginning to fall. And he said that it is only when man creates a true city of God, where he more or less forsakes his earthly pleasures and dedicates himself to God and God's eternal truths, will man be delivered from its his plight. And so his advice for a leader, Augustine of Hippo, is that he should rule as a truly Christian and Christian virtuous leader at that. So some of the types of things that you would expect would be him to be fair, him to be humane, magnanimous, forgiving. But that is not the advice that Machiavelli gives. Machiavelli says that the state is a man-made creation, and it should be completely separate from that of religion. And so his advice is quite different. If we look at we've already learned Marsiglio of Padua. Marsiglio of Padua was the conciliarist, and he said, he's the guy that kind of came up with this argument for the separation of church and state. Machiavelli tends to agree with him, all right? And so he believes that a leader, since he's dealing with imperfect humans, is going to have to, behave in an imperfect fashion, and that the way in which he should be judged should be based on how effective he is at maintaining peace and order. And so, his work is a little bit different. His work doesn't necessarily ascribe to this idea that man is terribly virtuous, which is, although he calls himself a humanist, you can see here this is evidence that not all the humanist writers were exactly the same. There's a lot of differences between them. He did value, like he said, that a leader should, there was merit in as a ruler when he points out and celebrates those things that man does good. Because if a ruler or a leader celebrates those things, then they're more likely, more apt to be repeated. So there is an element of celebration of excellence, but it's not the way that we see it in other works. At any rate, his book, The Prince, is very, very influential. We're going to see it influence some figures later on. This here is a picture of Cardinal Richelieu, who was the regent for Louis XIII, and he is going to practice a form of Machiavellian politics known as raison d'etat, which means reason of the day, and that his style of governing was like when you put the interests of the state ahead of everything else, making politically motivated decisions, being pragmatic versus being idealistic. These are the types of things that Machiavelli is talking about. When we look at this down here, this is the Leviathan, written by Thomas Hobbes, and he lived through the English Revolution and said that that people, because of their corrupt ways, need a strong leader to control them, and that safety was more important than anything else. Down here, you see Otto von Bismarck, and he coined the phrase realpolitik, or power politics, and that again, the interests of the state are supreme, and then if you have to do things that are considered immoral, so be it. When we look a little bit more into modern times, this is Richard Nixon and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and during the Cold War, the United States, decided to deal openly with China, which was a communist state, and Richard Nixon was the first American president to visit communist China, and we did so as a ploy to kind of get leverage against the Soviet Union and kind of force them to maybe begin talking to us a little bit more, and it was effective. It led to a period known as détente. At any rate, let's move on. Castiglione. Castiglione was a writer for the Book of the Courtier, and this kind of reminds us again that the Renaissance was an elitist movement, only for a very small segment of the population. The Book of the Courtier was a book that was written while at court, so a king and his entourage and his followers, and that this is who he surrounded himself with. Sometimes they were advisors, sometimes they were friends, sometimes they were even servants in a way. And it was expected that a courtier, a member of the court, was educated and had a certain I guess well-rounded set of skills. All right, and so this book takes place while at court, and it's like they're deciding what the ideal courtier would be like, and so this book had an audience. It had an audience of wealthy merchants who were beginning to rub elbows with the elite of society a little bit more, and this kind of helped them develop the social graces so that they can attend events and not stick out. All right, and so the focus of Castiglione's work is about that an educated man should have a background in a lot of different areas, subject matters, but that also he should be physically fit. He should be able to ride a horse. He should be able to fight with a sword. He should be able to, conduct like hand-to-hand combat through wrestling. But that he's got his more refined qualities. He could compose a sonnet. He could play a musical instrument. He could even sing. So these were all the things that was seen as ideal. This was ideal for a gentleman. Somebody of prominent birth, that they should possess these qualities. All right, so this is Castiglione's take on all of this. When we look at, I guess some other characteristics that we want to look at are also that he's graceful, and that he does everything that he does effortlessly. He doesn't want to appear to like that he's working hard. So his face, and his presence, everything has to be nonchalant, and that this is something that they just can naturally do. They can naturally do all of these things, and it's maybe a little bit difficult for us to appreciate that, but it does get at the heart of humanism, this idea of being well-rounded. Changing gears from humanism to secularism, this is another theme, that this is something that we can really look at to better understand the distinction between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And it is this, I guess, the focus is shifting away from what the medieval mindset was, and that was salvation. Life was short and difficult and full of human suffering, and Christians believed that that the life here on earth was simply a preparation for salvation, and that they were going to be challenged throughout their life by God, and that it's how they responded to that, and if they remained faithful, then they would receive God's grace and be able to attain salvation. That was certainly a medieval mindset. And there was also some superstition associated with that, because every time some kind of tragedy took place or a crisis, oftentimes people attributed that to God because they didn't understand the nature of what were causing these crises. So they naturally just assumed it was God, and that God was, this was God's wrath being visited upon them, and so therefore they needed to be much more pious and modest. And some interesting tidbits just to throw out there, that people did not focus on their lives as individuals. And one example of this is that most people didn't have last names. Most people were anonymous. There were many small villages that didn't have any names. Churches were built by unnamed architects because it wasn't about the person, it was about glorifying God. And so this is something that changes. And as people become more wealthy during this time period because of trade, they begin to get distracted, if you will, by ways to bring happiness to their life. And that was through the purchase of consumer items, and many of these were luxury items. And as time goes on, we start to develop a whole mindset known as secularism. All right, and so this is what leads them to serve many of these merchant families to serve as patrons of the arts, and they are hiring artists to adorn their personal residences and also their cities with works of art. Okay. And make sure you understand, too, that it's not just the wealthy merchant families that are the patrons of the arts, but many political leaders and also church leaders like popes and cardinals. And again, just talking about this, really, if it's not for the patronage of these wealthy elites, much of why we celebrate the Renaissance, and that is art, would not, there would be no purpose for it. So some of the church leaders, Pope Alexander VI, who was probably one of the most unsavory of the popes, did serve as a patron of the arts. And so the dome of St. Peter's Basilica and the Pietà, two pieces that we will be looking at in the second part of this chapter, he's responsible for that, his patronage. And then also Pope Julius II, the painting of the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo, also a work that we will celebrate, or at least look at, during the second part of this chapter. They did the same thing, and it says later here in the slide, with their homes. Many homes had private chapels, and so those private chapels were adorned with works of art as well. And so the other thing that bears mentioning is that secularism, although they are very consumed with the world around them, and that's why secularism is synonymous with the word worldly, it is written that these people were still devoutly Christian. All right, so that it's not as if they were turning their back on God. They just felt like they could achieve human happiness through worldly goods and not offend God while doing it. So that's important to note. So while we're talking about some of the artists, we should look at it and understand that art evolves, and you will understand that by the end of this year. There are going to be many different genres of art we're going to study, and you'll kind of understand how one leads to the next. And so when we look at Renaissance art, it's good to look at some of the late medieval artwork and kind of see, you'll begin to see how things are different. Two of the early, whether they're late medieval artists or early Renaissance artists, I guess it really doesn't matter for our purposes here. One is named Cimabue, and the other is Giotto, and these are, right on the heels, or right at the beginning of the Renaissance. But if you look, in both of these created similar works of the Madonna, you see the central figure is much larger than the others. And so here is Mary, the mother of Jesus, the Blessed Mother, and she is surrounded, she is flanked on both sides by angels who have halos around their heads. And you also notice that Mary and Jesus have those halos as well, and that is like a orb of light, which symbolizes their sacredness or their holiness. It is not that these are not space helmets that the air is rarefied and they need it to breathe oxygen. No, it just shows that they are important or sacred or holy. But again, if you notice, the angels seem to be smaller, okay? And that's not because they're further back in the background. It's just that they're not the prominent or central figure. So typically the central figure would be in the middle. Another kind of feature of medieval art is that their faces look pretty solemn, serious, very little emotion. And also there's not a tremendous attempt to make the people look distinct or different. So if you look at the angels, they kind of all look the same. And again, that's because individualism was not anything that was super important during the medieval time period, nor was realism. I mean, they look real enough, okay? And I think you see that also in this painting of the Madonna by Giotto, okay? Three artists that are important for bringing some of the new techniques or reviving some of the classical techniques, and then also kind of creating some new artistic techniques are Boccaccio, Donatello, and Brunelleschi, right? Boccaccio is going to do it with art, or with painting rather, Donatello with sculpture, and Brunelleschi with architecture, okay? So Brunelleschi is going to help, and he used a mirror with a hole in it to be able to, and I don't really understand it 100%, but it allows him to see through the mirror at what he wants to paint, but it's also a reflection. I don't know, it's some way in which he was able to geometrically create perspective. And so he is kind of known because there aren't any really classical artists or art that survived, paintings. So they don't really know whether or not perspective was anything that there's argument that they may have, but since there's no real proof, that's seen as a Renaissance kind of like innovation, the use of perspective. So make sure you know that. And then this building that you see underneath Brunelleschi's drawing there is the Pantheon, which is a Roman structure where they value or kind of lionize or the gods, and it is you see the columns in front of it, but the structure is topped with a dome. So we know that is and we'll learn about the shape of the circle later in part 2. But the saucer-shaped top is known as a dome, and we're going to see that replicated during the Renaissance. All right, so Masaccio's work is there's a couple of pieces that he's known for. One of his most famous is the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden after they've eaten from the forbidden fruit. And what you see on their faces is that of anguish and embarrassment and humiliation, and they're being driven out by an angel, a cherub, or I think the archangel Gabriel. But what's interesting to note is, other than they're naked, is the fact that they are coming out of the Garden of Eden and passing through an archway, which is a classical influence. And the fact that they are nude is important because this is the first nude since the classical era, since antiquity. So this is very significant. The date on this is about circa 1425. So this, and what else is that this is in a church. So that's kind of a big deal. In Florence, it's called the Santa Maria del Carmine, and this is near the altar, and you can see it in its natural setting in this picture down here. There, let's see, the muscled torso of Adam kind of shows this ideal form, and also there's an emphasis on realism. Okay, here's another. This painting is called Tribute Money, and it's also in this church, Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence, and it is also done by Boccaccio, and it shows Jesus and his disciples and Simon Peter going over and paying a tax to a tax collector. And the importance of this religiously is showing that Jesus supported man's requirement to abide by secular laws or temporal laws. So give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And so, basically Christ here is giving validation to, you have to respect the laws of government. Something else that's kind of noteworthy is the perspective. You see the mountains in the back, and so he is dabbling with it, although he hasn't not perfected it. You see an attempt to create more realism through perspective. Donatello is known because he created this classical bronze statue, and it is the first, again, since antiquity. Donatello was hired by the Medici to create this statue for their palace in Florence, and of course it's in the nude, so that is something relevant, and we will discuss that. And it is a biblical scene, so we see the blending of religion and classics, because it is, again, he's shown in the nude. The importance of David was, for the city of Florence, seen as a hero. So there are lots of artists who created statues of David. But this one is interesting because he looks youthful, to say the least. We're going to go into some of the other things in just a moment. But if you notice his hat, he has laurel leaves on it. And that would be a symbol of what? Victory. Okay, so also he's standing on the head of the slain Goliath, and again, there's some features here we're going to talk about that are very, very interesting, but also very controversial because of where I'm about to go here in just a second. He's youthful. He is, not shown as very muscular, so he's a boy. So it talks about the vigor of youth and things like that. But then it kind of departs, so it's going to get a little weird here in just a second. Okay, so this statue is shown as what's known as contrapposto. Need to know that. That's him leaning to one side, but it shows, and it'll become a lot easier to see with the other David that we'll look at in part 2. But contrapposto means it's like a temporary resting point, like shifting weight, and it's designed to show action, like movement in a stationary object. Okay, so again, the hat, the A lack of muscle tone shows this David as a very effeminate figure, and it is been argued that this is homoerotic, that this is about homosexual love and homosexuality. All right. So, one of the interests, this is considered 3D art because as you, the viewer, go around, you can see that there are different angles. And when you look at different angles, you see different things like this one. You see the helmet of Goliath and his mustache appears to be massaging the toe of David, what's that about? Again, the term homoeroticism comes up. And then if you notice, the feather from Goliath's helmet is riding up the inner thigh of David. What's that about? That, too, suggests homoeroticism. All right, here we go. So during this century, during the 14th and 15th century, homosexuality was not considered taboo among the elite. Not just the elite, but a lot of people. It was, in fact, commonplace, homosexuality. While members were married, while there was an attempt by the church to kind of, and the civil authorities to kind of cut down on this and to combat this, and so there was the creation of an official governmental agency. It was known as the Office of the Knight, and from like 1432 to 1502. There were like 17,000 different men arrested for the crime of, well, they didn't really have, the term homosexuality was not yet coined. That's not until like the 19th century, that term coined. So there were two different words that they used, or names, to describe like homosexuality. One was a crime against nature, and then the other was, I guess, because of the act of sodomy, I guess. Anyway, so I guess what we're meant, or what's important to note here, is that homosexuality was pervasive. So this is kind of rare for a time period, and it's just interesting to note that the typical for grown men, it was seen as socially acceptable and, in fact, desirable to have a youthful lover. So that is something that even homosexuality today does not call for. So it would be like consenting adults. But this was, there was actually a name, Il Cupolone was an adolescent partner, and if you look at David, he looks adolescent and he looks kind of submissive, and so that perhaps could be what Donatello was up to. So that would make this piece very controversial. Yes, it would. Moving on, Brunelleschi. He is responsible, and there's a typo, kids. Santa Maria del Fiore is the name of the church that he built the dome on, and he is responsible for being the first to create this classical style of architecture. And there was a challenge because there was a church in Florence that sat without a roof on it for a couple hundred years, in fact, and there was a wood shortage, and there was a challenge, and there was a concern that if they created a traditional Gothic roof, that it would take too long and too much wood, and they didn't have the resources to do it. So there was a challenge, and Brunelleschi entered it, and he came up with the idea of creating a dome. And he was not trained as an architect. He was a goldsmith, but he was extremely talented, and he was able to convince the city fathers that with his plan that he could do so, and that he would not require a lot of wood nor scaffolding to erect the structure, and it was built over a series of years. And this is like a schematic drawing of it. The actual place where the roof was, or the dome was created, was at the, most churches were built, I guess, if you look at it from a bird's eye view, in the shape of a crucifix, and so the dome went where the vertical and the horizontal lines intersected. And so his was an octagonal, not a saucer-shaped roof. It was octagon, and it was different because it also climbed like 150 feet in the sky. And so he was able to do it by creating rings around it, and that prevented it from falling in on itself. And that was one of the big concerns, that the weight of the dome itself would cause it to collapse, but it didn't. And this is seen as a masterpiece, and it still adorns the city today. And again, I apologize for the typo. It is not the Basilica of St. Lorenzo. It's the Santa Maria del Fiore. And it is also known just by its short name, Il Duomo. Okay, and it was complete in 1436. And let's see, I think that just have another picture, a modern picture of it today. Again, a close-up of the dome. All right, so that concludes it, kids. See ya.